All right, welcome back. So, in our last explainer, we really got into the weeds of how apartheid was built. If you need a refresher on how that whole system worked, I'd seriously recommend going back and watching that one. Today, though, we're peeling back a totally different layer of that history, and it's a story you almost never hear. Just pause for a second and think about that. When I say the fight against apartheid, whose face pops in your head? For pretty much all of us, a few very specific, incredibly important names come to mind. People who became global symbols of that struggle. And they should. I mean, these are the giants of the liberation movement. We're talking about icons like Nelson Mandela, Desmond Tutu, Steve Biko. Their courage, their sacrifice, it literally defined the entire movement. Their stories are the absolute bedrock of this history. Now, this question, this is what we're all about today. It kind of throws a wrench in the simple narrative, doesn't it? It points to this intense internal battle that was fought, not just in the townships, but inside the homes, churches, and minds of the very community that built apartheid. You know, it's easy to picture Afrikaner nationalism as this single, unified bloc, a monolith. But the reality, oh, it's so much more complicated. We're about to explore the incredible battle of conscience that raged within that community. So here's the key takeaway. Support for apartheid was not unanimous. Not even close. There was a small but incredibly important minority of Afrikaners who broke ranks. They turned their backs on their families, their culture, their church, all because they were convinced the system was just flat out wrong. And believe me, they paid a steep price for it. Let's start with maybe one of the most unbelievable stories of them all, a man named Bram Fischer. This guy represents descent from the absolute pinnacle of Afrikaner society. Just try to get your head around this contrast for a second. Fischer's grandfather was the prime minister of an Afrikaner republic. His dad was a top judge. He was basically legal royalty. But behind this perfect establishment facade, he was secretly a committed communist and one of the key brains in the resistance. And what's so fascinating is how you can see his two different roles here. In public, he was Nelson Mandela's lead lawyer at the Rivonia trial. His legal brilliance, and I mean brilliance, is what saved the entire leadership of the ANC from the death penalty. But behind the scenes, his secret work sent shockwaves through the Afrikaner elite. He proved their unified front was cracking, right from the inside. And this timeline, wow, it just lays out the incredible cost of his conviction. After that famous trial, he could have just left the country. Instead, he went into hiding to rebuild the movement. He was eventually caught, put on trial himself, and sentenced to life. He sacrificed his privilege, his freedom, and ultimately his life for what he believed in. So Fischer challenged the political and legal system from the inside. Our next figure, Bears Now Day, went after its spiritual backbone, the church itself. I mean, this is a head-on collision of ideas. The Dutch Reformed Church was the glue holding Afrikaner society together. It gave apartheid its moral permission slip, saying it was God's plan. And then you have Beyers Nade, a high-ranking minister from a legendary church family who gets up and says, no, this is a sin. This is a heresy. He literally used theology as a weapon against the state. The backlash was swift and brutal. He was stripped of his position, kicked out of his own church, and became a total outcast. The very community he had served his entire life just turned its back on him. He picked his conscience over his career, his status, and his entire culture. So, we've seen dissent in the courts and in the church, but this battle was also fought on the cultural front, through the powerful words of a poet named Breitenbach. Breitenbach wasn't just any poet. He was a superstar, one of the most famous poets writing in the Afrikaans language. He was part of this rebellious literary movement in the 60s called the Sestigers, who used their poems and novels to poke holes in the rigid, racist culture of the time. And don't think the government saw it as just art. His activism landed him in prison for 7 years on treason charges. That's how much of a threat they thought his words were. This quote just flips the whole script. The government and their old community called these people traitors, volksverraaiers. But if you think about it, by fighting for a just, non-racial future for all South Africans, you could argue they were the truest patriots of all. And it's so important to realize these three weren't just isolated cases. They were part of a larger, what you might call, army of conscience. You had guys like Frederick van Zyl-Slabbert, who was the leader of the opposition in parliament until he just resigned, saying the whole whites-only system was a joke. And activists like Marius Schoen, who paid a price that's just unimaginable. The regime sent a parcel bomb that killed his wife and young daughter. This dissent was simmering all over Afrikaner society. So how do we remember these people today? What is the legacy of all this internal dissent? This picture here with the graffiti, it just says it all, doesn't it? For these activists, it wasn't enough to just disagree in private. They felt they had to act. They had to turn their beliefs into real, risky actions that had major consequences. And there is some recognition today. Buyers Noaday, the man who was cast out, now has a whole center for public theology named after him at Stellenbosch University, which was the intellectual heart of Afrikaner nationalism. The irony is powerful. It shows that history is being re-examined. But this kind of formal honor is still pretty rare. Which brings us to a really big question. If these people were so courageous, why aren't Fisher and Noaday household names like the other anti-apartheid heroes? Well, the truth is, their stories make things complicated. They mess with the easy black versus white story that we often tell about apartheid. They show us that the real battle lines weren't just between groups, but through them. They force us to see the struggle as this deeply personal, messy, and complex thing that was fought on so many different fronts. And that kind of leaves us with one last thought. Because these stories, they're not just about South Africa. They ask a question that's timeless and universal. What does it really take to stand against your own tribe, your own people, for a principle you know is right, especially when it could cost you absolutely everything? Something to think about. Thanks for joining us.